Now, both of you, is it important, you will say of course it is it important that you both get on with each other?
It helps.
Yeah, it helps. I think certainly what unites us is a love for opera. I mean, that sounds like such a banal thing to say, but we love theatre. I love the theatre of the music, and I think he loves the music of the theatre. And you mix that all up, and the idea is to create something that is convincing on all fronts.
But you've been here 2 years now, so
year and a half, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, a lot of what's happening now has already been set.
Oh my God. I mean, the frustrating thing about this job is every time we sit down and have a good idea, we say, oh, fantastic, we can do that in 2018. It's ridiculous. Sometimes we make plans now for 2020.
So how stitched up are you for the next few years then? Or can you always slip something
well,
else
16, 17 is almost
more or less
done.
But then, of course, there are things during the season that then changes for one reason or the other. You get the, I mean, this season already we can make some changes. So I think it's going to be impossible to say exactly what things. It's really a fluctuating. And sometimes we have to worry about things that happen tomorrow, and sometimes you have to worry about things for 2020. It's really a. I think what's really important in that work is, though, to keep the curiosity. I mean, as you say, the passion, but also the curiosity, that you don't get to a stage where you say, okay, this is how we do opera, but you keep thinking about, why is it important? How does it touch people? What is happening in society?
Yes, exactly. What was happening in society? How much do you think, well, actually, this is interesting now, I mean, and we should try doing some modern opera, and we should try put on some classics, and you're always trying to get a good mix in the house.
Well, I think what's fascinating about the building in itself is this multiple realities that we live. You know, we've got a performance of La Bohème tonight. We've got the Minotaur that's on stage. Onegin is rehearsing. There was a model showing for Rossini's La Donna del Lago this morning.
And you've got the ballet.
And we've got the ballet, and so we're living in the future. We're living in the present. We're certainly opera is a lot about the past, but it's these realities that.
And there's one more thing. I mean, which is also the location of the building, which is geographically in the center of Covent Garden. 40 million people coming here. We are indeed in the heart of a city, a modern city, and to stay in touch, that opera doesn't become an island, but so that, for instance, Anna Nicole was, before I arrived, an incredible attempt at reaching out and taking contemporary theme. But interestingly enough, also when we do La Bohème in classical costume, that can be very, very contemporary. It's not one-to-one. It's not just thinking, oh, the world is modern, so we do modern. It's much more delicate how you try to connect with what the audience out there needs and dreams about and are curious about.
Well, one of the most important things to deal with in the opera is nostalgia. People love nostalgia, and now it doesn't mean that you should fall back onto all the given traditions and the way things have always been done, and let's do it in the old-fashioned way. No, but nostalgia is something that I think today's society must not lose. It's something that every human being needs, a memory, even of something that hasn't happened.
Memory in Onegin is a Proust,
No, exactly, and I think you need to.
Onegin is full of nostalgia.
It is almost the most melancholic piece in the rap, and that's what we're trying to do in the production, how to make it about memories. But also it's I think. When you need to be aware of what people's nostalgia is and what that need for nostalgia, and then maybe play with it and trick. I mean, sometimes I find it funny when I talk to people, and I'm a director, so they always say, "Why do you have to change things? And why can't you just do it like Mozart wanted it, if it's Figaro or something?" And actually, if you ask them, it has nothing to do with what that piece would have looked like in Mozart's time. We can't imagine today what it would look like in it. What they mean is, why don't you do Mozart like it looked like in 1955 when I saw it the first time? That's the nostalgia.
There's lots of questions here, but I want to ask you about that. When did you first see? I mean, what was your first operatic experience, Tony?
Well, my first operatic experience was, I think,
probably before mine.
Just a little. Get that.
I saw my father perform the tenor role Canio in Pagliacci. I think it was an amateur setup here in London. And it was, I'll never forget that.
What were you, 8, 7?
I can't remember how old I was, but maybe 10 or something. But I remember very clearly him killing the soprano. and I remember very clearly this knife that we'd bought for the occasion, which was a plastic knife, completely shattered by then, because my father's intensity was such that it had smashed this knife, after he fake, stabbed her, and I mean, just telling the story, the feeling of theatre and make believe, and that I live in this world. Not that I get stabbed every day or I do the stabbing, but this world of huge emotions, not just little emotions, but the biggest emotions, so big that we need to sing about them and not talk.
And what about you?
It's very different and similar in a way. I was 9 years old. I come from a family of economists and bankers and who were culturally interested, but were not particularly into opera. And my father took me to Carmen when I was 9 years old, and I completely fell in love with it. I wanted to go back. I saw, I think, Falstaff as my next thing, and then I ended up within a year. I wanted to go every week, and my parents stopped.
Well, luckily there were bankers
actually,
and economists.
we're not. Yeah, but they didn't want to go to opera that often, so they ended up driving me to the theatre, dropping me off. I was 11. I just would go in, buy a ticket, go in and sit by myself and be picked up at the end. And when I took over at the Royal Danish Opera, where I was artistic director before, actually some of the older people in the box office could still remember me from when I was 11 and could hardly reach out. I think for me it's the same. It was giving a language. I was sitting there with all these emotions inside me. I couldn't give a language to it. And suddenly having a language to talk about what life really is like, because reality is not what life is really like. For each of us, life is very much about when we fall in love, when disaster happens, fears and excitement. Opera gives a voice or a language to what life feels like for each of us, rather than to just make a picture of what reality looks like. And I think that's what fascinates me.
In extreme circumstances.
Yes. We've got questions here from all over the world. We've got US, from Germany. Here's one from Ali from Germany to both of you. What do you think is the main difference in the Royal Opera House and other opera houses around the world?
I think it's hard to put into very few words, because that's a sense of feeling. There are many great opera houses in the world. For me, this place has a very special mix of a family atmosphere. It's really nice to work here. It's lovely people. It's great to come to work, but still extremely professional. Sometimes you will find in other houses professional, but slightly more hierarchical, or you will find very friendly, but maybe slightly chaotic. I'm not saying all opera houses, but definitely the mix here is incredible between the warmth and the professionalism. I think that's something we really should treasure.
But let's go back to Rachel Staunton, a question from her from London. Really enjoying watching you guys. How many languages can you work in? And actually we'll link that to Jack Lovells from Cardiff, who says, how important is multilingualism for opera conductors and how do you start learning? So languages.
Well, I speak English, French, German, Italian, some Spanish, and a few phrases in Norwegian. I think it's very, very important for a conductor to have a handle on different languages, because every language has a musicality of its own, rhythmically speaking, color-wise, and direction-wise. Some languages are more halting, some languages are more flowing. Some languages are more perfumed, some are more guttural, some have more accents. What we call, but in music is vertical, chords, bum, 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 or horizontal, that kind of, and languages act in the same way. And it's very important to know the difference.
But you grew up speaking Danish and English, but you also grew up by your own lights, and we heard this earlier, learning Russian.
Yes, I've forgotten most of it, I'm sad to say, but I still know what's the verb and I can read the letters, and that helps a lot when you work with a Yigin. Still, I had to sit down before we started.
Which is in Russian.
Which is in Russian, we sing in Russian. I had to sit down months ago and write down literally every word in the music. What does every word literally mean? It's not enough to know what the phrase is about. You need to know this is the word.
Is that the same for your performers, actually, in terms to get the proper emotion
Sure, otherwise you
out of it?
can't do a real performance unless you understand every word. But that's, of course, tricky if you don't speak it. And as you saw in our rehearsal, not just for the language we're singing in, but also in the rehearsal room, you speak German with some singers, you speak English with other singers.
Yes, I saw you speaking German with
because for Krasimira, she feels more confident in German. She speaks English fine, but so when we have to talk some nuances, she prefers German.
That's interesting, because what you've got there is you've got Onegin, probably speaks a bit of German, but is that awkward when you're speaking to one of your principals in German to explain something to her, and another of your principals doesn't understand what you're saying?
It can be tricky, and then you have to almost say everything twice sometimes. But it's one of the joys about opera also. I love the fact that opera is not nationalist. Quite the contrary, opera is and had always been. Even before the globalization, opera was globalized. And I love the energy of bringing different cultures into the rehearsal room and trying to make it work across all of that. How music unites across all those languages.
A few more questions now, but here, what would you recommend as an opera to see if it's your first opera? If you want to get someone hooked?
La Bohème is a good bet.
Yeah. Rigoletto.
Rigoletto. Why Rigoletto?
Well, Rigoletto has, first of all, it's a fantastic story. You have very, very clearly defined characters. There's very clear good and evil. You have an array of hit tunes, one after the other, that you recognize, even if you know nothing about classical music and if you know nothing about opera, you recognize them. They are that iconic. And I think that that's important as a hook.
Before I ask you, Kasper, let me just say to anyone watching, #RO Live, tell us what your favourite opera is and what you would recommend to a first-time opera goer.
I think actually opera is, the beauty of opera is it can be so many things. In a way it encompasses all of life. So I'd say if you are new to opera, it depends on you. So find out a bit. We have a mix. Some people might prefer the Minotaur, which is a complex, rich, dark work that they might like better than something that they would see as a bit sentimental in La Bohème or Rigoletto. Other people might like to go in where they recognize the tunes. Some people might prefer the ambition of Wagner, where it's philosophical and difficult, or something modern like Anna Nicole or Nixon in China, which is political and feels fresh. And you know, I think you've got to find out where your curiosity is. Opera can be a lot of different things, and we try to have a mix of very different things. So find out what makes you curious.
And here is another. This is from Thea King to both of you. What non-opera music guilty pleasures do you listen to? Or not necessarily guilty, but what's your, you know, are you Metallica fans?
No, I listen to, I keep returning to the music of the 70s that I grew up with, you know, Earth, Wind and Fire and that kind of thing, and T-Rex and all that stuff, rhythm and blues. But I love jazz also, especially the piano players, and I love all the big singers, Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett.
Yeah, and you grew up in America, of course.
Yes, well, as a teenager, yes. I grew up here first, and then, so that music is very, very important to me. I think music is music, and if it inspires, you know, and if it's got an energy, and if it's, I don't know, if it's sexy, if it's
what were you listening to in Denmark as a teenager?
I should probably not be too honest, because this is a bit shameful. First of all, I'm a real nerd, so I listen mostly to opera and classical music. When I finally don't, it's stuff like ABBA and that kind of really cheap Swedish pop that I find is really, so it's kind of is a guilty pleasure. But right now I'm actually, my repertoire in children's songs is expanding quickly. I have a daughter of 8 months, so you learn a whole new repertoire of children's songs suddenly. It was when she was born, I didn't know any children's songs, so I sang Voi che sapete from Figaro to her. I think that's pretty nerdy. So now I need to learn some children's songs.
Right, exactly. But for people coming to opera, and perhaps for the first time, it's daunting, or is it, to think about what you pay? But I mean, is it a myth that you have to pay a lot of money to come to opera? I mean, there's a huge range of prices.
Listen, you get something really special at the opera house. You get hundreds of people performing live for you. So it is a special occasion. It is something special. It is a luxury thing. We do have seats that are much more affordable. We do have a range of prices. We have performances where the top price is 65, where you can get in for as little as 10, 15 pounds. We have, across the season, more than half of our seats are sold at 55 pounds or less. I think that people don't realise that.
It is priced for a football match,
and actually, just a couple of weeks ago, I tried to sit up in the guards, as we call it, in the amphitheatre, with some of the cheaper seats, just to see what's it like. It was incredibly good seats. I was really moved by that performance of La Bohème. So don't be discouraged. I think, you know what, I think that our worst enemy in opera, that's all the prejudice people have about it. People who don't like opera, it's normally because they've never seen one. It's because they think it's too expensive, or they think it's not for me, or they don't. When people come here, they often find out that it's much more accessible than you think. People think opera is elitist. Actually, look at Figaro. It's a very subversive story. Many operas are actually very subversive. I think give it a shot, because you're cheating yourself out of something really interesting if you don't try it.